Hi, thank you for watching the presentation of the Dutch longitudinal DLD study. My name is Britt. I'm one of the senior researchers at the Royal Dutch Auris Group, and I'll be talking you through the slides on behalf of the entire project team of the DLD study, which consists of members from Auris, NSDSK, Kentalis, Pento, and Adelante. And these are all organizations that provide care to children with DLD in the Netherlands. In this presentation, we'll show you some preliminary results of our longitudinal study that give rise to, as always, more interesting research questions and avenues that we can use in our project pertaining to the relationship between language and social emotional functioning. I'll start by giving you a brief overview of the project, and then I'll get into some preliminary results of two issues that we've been exploring so far. So the DLD study, also a really nice acronym, by the way, or in Dutch Taalinzicht, started data collection a couple of years ago. And the goal of the project is to try and explain the variation in developmental patterns of children with suspected DLD. And in an attempt to do so, we try to unravel relations between language and other domains, like social emotional functioning and communicative participation. Little is known about the factors actually that predict variation in developmental patterns and outcomes in different domains. So there are some studies that have looked at these relationships already internationally, such as the Manchester Language Study, but ours is the first longitudinal study in the Netherlands that investigates children with DLD. And hopefully the outcomes of our study will add to our understanding of DLD in general, and also aid children with DLD in Dutch care and education specifically. So at the start of the project, we actually aimed to include 600 children with suspected DLD before they entered primary school, and to follow these children for 20 years. So we've identified some time points that we think are key transitional moments in life, such as the transition to grade 1, the transition to high school, further education, and the transition to a job. And today I'll show you some results that cover the first 3 time points. So T0, which was the measurements were done when children were not at school yet, so before school entrance. At T1, that was 6 months after the start of primary school, and T2, which was at the transition to grade 1. And because these are actually cohorts of children, right, that are taking part of in our project, not all participants, so not all 600 participants, obviously have completed data collection at all 3 time points yet. So please note that all the results that I'm presenting today are still preliminary. So on this slide, you can also see the measures that were administered at these 3 time points. Please note that these lists are not exhaustive. I've only listed the measures that we'll be talking about today. More measures were administered at these time points, and I'll not be reporting about those. So as mentioned, we were interested in well-being of children with DLD as they mature. So at the early time points, we already included social emotional functioning questionnaires, and these were filled out by their parents. And we were interested in the relation between language as measured at the start of our project and social emotional well-being at 6 months after the start of primary school and at the start of grade 1. So the first question that I'll be answering is, do language abilities and or communicative participation at T0 predict social emotional functioning at T1 and at T2? I'll present these results first, and then I'll dive into the second question. So before we dive into the results, I'll share some background info with you first, and then I'll show you the regression analysis. So as mentioned, we've used data from different time points. So over here, you can see whose data we've actually been using, right? So it's 146 children that have completed data collection at T0, T1, and T2. And out of these 146 children, 105 were boys. So we've displayed the mean age at the different time points, as well as their language and cognitive scores, IQ, at T0. Social emotional functioning scores are also displayed here at the bottom right. Here, actually, having a higher score means that they're doing worse. So for the language and IQ, obviously, a higher score is better. But at the social emotional functioning scores, it means like when it's higher, you're doing worse. So the mean at T1 is 15.48. At T2, it's 38.45. These scores are different because we actually use two different questionnaires at these two time points, which has to do with the age of the children, actually, which questionnaire we can use. So therefore the measures are different. What should be noted is actually that these scores fall within the subclinical and clinical ranges of social emotional functioning. So on average, there is actually this group of children is not really doing all that well. So let's have a look at the regression analyses. So what we did was we took social emotional functioning as an outcome measure, and we entered language measures and IQ and communicative participation as predictors into our model. So here's our model. And what we see happening here is that when we look at whether IQ predicts any of the variance in social emotional functioning at T1, is that it actually doesn't. So it doesn't do anything. And what about language then? Actually, it doesn't again. So none of our 4 language measures significantly predicts any variance in social emotional functioning at T1. What about communicative participation then? That actually does. Communicative participation is a significant predictor for social emotional functioning at T1. However, this model in itself, it only predicts 7% of the variance in social emotional functioning at T1. Also, with these 146 children in it, this model is not yet a great fit. So we have to wait basically until our data collection is, goes on, our group is bigger, and we can redo these analyses and wait for this model to become significant. But going back to the 7% of explained variance, right? It's not a lot. This makes us wonder, what about the other 93%, right? What else is going on? Perhaps other things are going on outside of these measures that influence social emotional functioning that we haven't looked at or maybe haven't even included in our data yet. So that's an interesting thing to ponder about. So now, what about predictors for social emotional functioning at T2? Again, we looked at IQ, language, and communicative participation, and we see that IQ is not a significant predictor for social emotional functioning. Neither are the language skills. Again, they don't do anything. But communicative participation, again, predicts social emotional functioning significantly. Now, I'm hearing you think, hey, but what about social emotional functioning at T1? Yes, of course, that would be really interesting to include in this model as well. Right? Because you're measuring sort of the same construct. So that's what we did. We entered it into the model, and yes, indeed, social emotional functioning at T1 is a significant predictor for social emotional functioning at T2 as well. And taken together, this model predicts 19% of the variance in social emotional functioning at T2. And actually, the largest portion that is explained by this model is due to the fact that we entered social emotional functioning at T1 into this model. Alrighty. So with these data that I've just shown you, we can give a tentative answer to the question whether language, cognitive abilities, or communicative participation actually predict social emotional functioning. And we see here that language measures and IQ, for that matter, have no predictive value for social emotional functioning. Rather, communicative participation seems to account for the variance in social emotional functioning a tiny wee bit, right? Based on earlier work, we expected language scores to predict social emotional functioning, assuming that having DLD to some extent affect this. And I mean, while we've shown that our social emotional functioning scores are within the subclinical ranges, we have not seen that language scores from the children themselves actually predict social emotional functioning. And actually, the studies that have reported relations between language and social emotional functioning also have only looked at the language status, not actually the language tests that were used, just whether a kid had DLD or didn't have DLD, and then they looked at group difference there. So that is something to think about. Also, another thing is that the questionnaires that we administered were filled out by parents, whereas the language measures were actually from the kids themselves. So this might have influenced the results to some extent as well. So interestingly, communicative participation did predict social emotional functioning. And communicative participation is a nice measure. It's very interesting because it tells us something about the extent to which language can be used to participate in society. And that's something you want for the kids with DLD, right? So the question is then, what about these language measures? Can these predict communicative participation, right? I'll dive into that question right now. So the question is, which factors are predictive for communicative participation in 4-year-old children with DLD? As you know, we administered several language measures at T0, and we also administered a speech intelligibility questionnaire at T1, and these language measures we're using to predict communicative participation at T1. So we're including these measures as predictors. Let's dive into that. So here again, we see background variables. We have a bigger N here, right? We have 502 kids that completed T0 and T1. So I'll just present these data from this bigger group of kids here. Again, we have about 75% of the kids that were boys. And you see the language and intelligibility and IQ measures listed here in the tables. As for communicative participation, you see the division of scores here. The mean score at communicative participation was about 6. And this questionnaire included items like, my child can communicate independently with unfamiliar adults, or my child can communicate independently with other children and peers. And then the parents had to fill out whether they strongly disagreed or strongly agreed and anything in between, right? Now let's see what actually predicts the scores on communicative participation here, and which of these predictors are significant. As you can see, IQ does not predict communicative participation. With regard to language skills, we looked at receptive and expressive vocabulary, expressive grammar, and language comprehension. And what we see here is that 3 out of 4 measures are not significant, but expressive grammar is. And lastly, intelligibility, let's look at that. Wow, mega significant. So what we see here is that expressive grammar and speech intelligibility both predict communicative participation at T1. And this model predicts 46.5% of the variance in communicative participation at T1. So that's a pretty good score, right? So expressive grammar and speech intelligibility seem to matter in the extent to which children can independently communicate and participate with their surroundings. So, yeah, we do have something to take home and think about, right? What we can conclude from our data is that we've seen that language measures predict communicative participation, so both grammar and speech intelligibility, and also that communicative participation to some extent predicts social emotional functioning, and that social emotional functioning at T1 predicts it at T2. Interestingly, though, we have a lot of variables that we took into account, but hardly any variance in social emotional functioning is really explained by those specific variables. So this makes us wonder what else is out there that actually can predict social emotional functioning in children with suspected DLD. And this information is actually crucial for intervention and treatment, since we do see that these kids often score within the subclinical ranges of social emotional functioning. Another thing that we should think about is the role of communicative participation, because what I've shown you today is an analysis with language predicting communicative participation, and another analysis where communicative participation predicts social emotional functioning, whereas we initially thought that maybe language would predict social emotional functioning. But maybe the relation between language and social emotional functioning is there, but it is mediated by communicative participation. So once our data collection is complete, or at least for T0, T1, and T2, we should definitely check out the relationship between language and social emotional functioning again, and looking at communicative participation as a possible mediator, right? Because the results that I've presented to you today definitely give rise to that idea. I think that's it for me. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you for watching. Also, a big shout out to the parents, children, and all the professionals from our organization that helped collecting these data. We'll be happy to answer any questions. Please contact us at info@projecttaalinzicht.nl.